Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1: A Death Over Dinner. The fog that evening lay low and patient over Chelsea, curling around lampposts and softening the sharp lines of the Georgian terraces. Hercule Poirot, who considered fog an indignity visited upon the well-dressed, emerged from his cab with his hat angled just so, his umbrella carried with the precision of a fencing foil. He had been coaxed out of his warm flat by Armand Lefebvre, maître d'hôtel of la Belle Étoile, a restaurant as proud of its elegance as Poirot was of his moustaches. Over the telephone, Armand had promised a quiet table away from drafts, a soufflé as light as a promise, and company of the most discreet sort. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of roasting meat and rich sauces. The clink of silver on china mingled with low, civilized conversation. Armand, in his immaculate tailcoat, swooped forward to greet him. "Mon cher Monsieur Poirot," he said with theatrical warmth. "Your table awaits, halfway between the fire and the kitchen door, exactly as you prefer. The cutlery, aligned, the glasses, equidistant. You will find all in order." Poirot inclined his head approvingly. The tablecloth was white enough to dazzle, the napkin folded into a precise fan. He adjusted the knife by a fraction and seated himself, satisfied that, in this small corner of the world at least, symmetry reigned. The dining room's mirrored wall allowed him, with the smallest tilt of the head, to observe without seeming to. He noted a young couple in animated discussion near the window, an elderly widow at the fireplace, gazing into the flames, a portly wine merchant whose smile was as rehearsed as any salesman's. And then, at the third table along the mirrored wall, a man and a young woman who drew his eye. The man was in his mid-40s, dark hair disciplined into place, his grey suit cut as neatly as a legal argument. The woman, perhaps 30, wore a pale blouse and had a secretary's air of quiet competence. The man spoke often, gesturing with a hand that dismissed as much as it emphasized. The woman listened, sometimes frowning faintly. There was no warmth between them, only the taut wire of formality. Poirot's souper éloignon arrived, crowned with melted cheese. He took a slow, appreciative spoonful while watching the pair. At one point, the woman reached into her handbag and withdrew a slim packet of papers secured with an elastic band. She slid it across the table. The man placed his palm over it, said something curt, and pushed it aside. She colored slightly and stared at the salt cellar as though it might offer counsel. A party of 3 entered noisily, bringing a breath of fog and damp wool. While the waiter settled them, Poirot glanced back to the grey-suited man. Now there was a small silver case in his hand, snapped shut and slipped into his pocket with the neatness of habit. The woman was speaking again, low and quick. The man cut her short with a tight shake of the head. The next course arrived at their table, poached turbot for him, coq au vin for her. They ate in silence. Poirot noted that the man's napkin was no longer on his lap but folded carefully beside his plate, an odd displacement for mid-meal. Poirot had turned his attention to his own main course when the sound came, a sharp, metallic clatter. Looking up, he saw the man in grey lurch forward. His spoon fell to the floor. His head dropped heavily onto the rim of his plate, tilting it, the fish sliding in a slow, undignified collapse onto the cloth. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the woman gave a cry, high, ragged, urgent. "Philip! Oh God, Philip!" Chairs scraped, voices rose. The wine merchant half stood, the widow pressed a hand to her throat. Armand was already at the table, his face set in professional calm, bending to speak to the stricken man. A waiter fetched brandy, another hurried to the telephone. Poirot rose but did not hurry. He had seen enough sudden collapses to know that bustle rarely brought clarity. He arrived as straightened, shaking his head once. "It is no use," the maître d' murmured to Poirot in French. "He is gone." The young woman was trembling, her eyes bright with tears. He took something," she stammered. "I couldn't stop him, he wouldn't listen," she broke off, dabbing at her face. The police were summoned. Inspector Sharp, a solid man with a notebook already in hand, asked the routine questions. The man was identified as Philip Harcourt, a barrister of some reputation. The woman was Miss Clara Briggs, his secretary. She explained, haltingly, that he had been despondent over professional troubles and had carried a small vial with him for weeks. Indeed, a vial was found in Harcourt's inner pocket, glass, stoppered, with a faint bitter odour. A folded note was produced from another pocket. In an even, deliberate hand, it read, "It ends here." To Sharp, the conclusion was plain. To Poirot, it was anything but. His eyes travelled over the table, the perfectly folded napkin, the spoon aligned with the knife, the wine glass precisely placed. These were not the chaotic remnants of a man's last frantic moments. Poirot's gaze shifted to the bread plate, unused, yet with a faint dusting of white along its edge. Curious. He looked once more at the mirrored wall. It reflected the diners, the door, the street beyond still cloaked in fog. A detail, a pattern, was beginning to whisper at the edges of his mind. But Poirot, who never trusted first impressions, merely twirled the end of his moustache and said, very softly to himself, "Non, mon ami Harcourt. You did not wish to leave this world tonight." Chapter 2, An Unwanted Accusation. The morning after the scene at La Belle Étoile dawned grey and reluctant. Poirot, who believed even London's weather should make an effort, sat at his breakfast table with a perfectly boiled egg, a pot of chocolate, and the Times. The newspaper, with a mixture of solemnity and relish, devoted a column to the death of Philip Harcourt. The facts were presented with the brisk inevitability of gossip dressed in its Sunday best. Well-known barrister dies suddenly during dinner in Chelsea restaurant. There was mention of professional strain and personal difficulties, without detail. The most striking line came at the end, "Police are not seeking any other person in connection with the incident." Poirot's eyes narrowed. The ink was hardly dry, yet the conclusion had been reached. Suicide, neatly tied with a ribbon. Too neat, Poirot thought, as neat as the fold of Harcourt's napkin. At 10 o'clock sharp, Inspector Sharp telephoned. His voice was that of a man who wished to be polite to a celebrity, but not encouraged. "Thought you'd like to know, Poirot, we've confirmed it. Harcourt took poison. Vial in his pocket, suicide note in his coat. Witness, Miss Briggs, says she saw the signs for weeks." "Ah, mon cher," Poirot replied with courteous regret, "signs are like the English weather, much talked about, seldom what they seem." Sharp gave a small huff. "I appreciate your philosophy. But there's no case here. Man was under pressure, made his choice. That's all." Poirot's voice became silk over steel. Pressure, yes, but to end his life at the dinner table, in public, with the precise alignment of his spoon and knife. That is not despair, Inspector. That is performance. And I do not think Monsieur Harcourt was the actor in this play. Sharp muttered something about Belgian imagination, then invited Poirot, more from duty than desire, to view the preliminary statements at the station. The police station in Chelsea smelled faintly of damp wool and old tobacco. Sharp received Poirot in a cramped office where a typewriter clacked somewhere beyond the door. The inspector pushed across a thin file. Statements from the companion, the waiter, and 2 diners nearby. Poirot began with Miss Clara Briggs. Her handwriting was small and careful. She claimed that Harcourt had been increasingly morose since the collapse of a high-profile trial. He had spoken of ending it more than once. At dinner, she said, he had barely touched his fish, had drunk 2 glasses of wine, and shortly after, collapsed. She denied placing anything in his food or drink. Poirot paused, recalling what he had seen in the mirror. The packet of papers passed under the man's palm. The statement made no mention of it. The second witness, Leonard Rowe, wine merchant, reported seeing Miss Briggs pass something across the table before the main course. He thought it looked like a small envelope or case. The third, Mrs. Eleanor Weatherby, widow, remembered Harcourt's sharp tone. "We will discuss it later." The phrase, to Poirot, sounded not like despair, but the promise of unfinished business. The waiter's account was more practical. He had seen Harcourt raise his wine glass without Miss Briggs touching hers. Moments later, Harcourt coughed, turned pale, and collapsed. Poirot closed the file gently. "Mon ami, you have here a puzzle with too many corners. You have the lady who says she gave nothing of harm, the gentleman who swears she passed something, and the other lady who heard words that suggest a meeting yet to come. It does not fit into the frame of suicide." Sharp tapped the desk with his pen. "You're assuming the truth's complicated." "Sometimes it isn't." Poirot gave him a look of mild pity. "Sometimes, yes. But when a man folds his napkin before dying, it is complicated." Sharp's eyebrows rose. "You keep coming back to that." "It is a small thing," Poirot agreed, "and it is always the small things that betray the big ones." After leaving the station, Poirot decided to walk, letting his mind stir the facts as one might swirl cream into coffee. Harcourt had been a man of order. His clothing, his manner, even the arrangement of his place setting suggested control. Would such a man choose a public, messy end? Poirot doubted it. He passed along streets still glistening from the night's drizzle, the air tinged with the scent of wet brick and coal smoke. At a tobacconist's window he stopped short. There, displayed among pipes and packets, was a small silver cigarette case, the exact twin of the one Harcourt had held the previous evening. Poirot entered, inquired politely, and learned that such cases were popular gifts from one gentleman to another in legal circles. As he stepped back into the street, Poirot's mind touched on a possibility, the case as a vessel for something not tobacco. The notion was filed away among his petite cellules grises for later examination. By noon, he was at Harcourt's chambers. The clerk, a thin man with a wary expression, admitted Poirot with reluctance. The office was tidy to the point of sterility, books aligned, papers squared, no sign of haste or distress. On the desk sat an ink bottle, but Poirot noticed at once that it was not the same brand as the others in the room. Its label was plain, and the ink within gave off a faint, chemical odor. He bent closer, sniffing delicately. Not ordinary ink. Something had been substituted. Poison? Perhaps. Or perhaps merely an echo of the true method. Poirot said nothing, merely noted the absence of the original inkwell stand, a small empty circle in the dust on the desk. In the afternoon, Poirot paid a call on Miss Briggs at her modest flat in Pimlico. She looked pale but composed, dressed in a cardigan of earnest brown. "Mr. Poirot," she began, "I've told the police everything. Mr. Harcourt was not himself these past weeks. He could be cruel. I was thinking of leaving his employ." Poirot inclined his head. "And the packet you gave him at dinner?" A flicker of unease crossed her face. "Legal documents. A draft of a will he was preparing for a client. I thought it better to give them in person." "And this client?" Poirot asked. "I don't recall the name," she said too quickly. Poirot filed that, too. "You understand, mademoiselle," he said gently, "that when a man dies suddenly, every action, every word, every object takes on a new weight." She met his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "I didn't kill him, Mr. Poirot." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but you see, I do not say you did." By the time Poirot returned home, the fog was beginning to creep in again. He stood at his sitting room window, watching the lamp's halo into the mist. Somewhere among the small observations of the last 24 hours, the folded napkin, the mirrored wall, the missing inkwell, the silver case, lay the path to the truth. Poirot turned from the window, murmuring to himself in French. "It is like a chessboard, mon ami. The pieces are placed, but the first move, that I must discover." In the street below, a car passed slowly, its tires hissing on wet pavement. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Tomorrow, he decided, he would return to La Belle Étoile. There were still questions to be asked, and one or two people whose answers, he suspected, would not match the picture they had tried so hard to paint. Chapter 3: The Witnesses. The next morning, Poirot rose earlier than usual. His mind, restless with half-formed ideas, had arranged a plan in the small hours. The scene at La Belle Étoile must be revisited, not for the food, though Armand's kitchen tempted him, but for the people who had been present that fateful night. In his experience, the truth about a murder often slipped through the police net not because it was invisible, but because it was overlooked. When Poirot entered the restaurant shortly after 10, the dining room was a quieter, paler version of its evening self. Chairs stood neatly under tables, the mirror caught only the weak winter light, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish. Armand greeted him with a subdued bow. Death in a dining room, Poirot knew, clung to the atmosphere like stale smoke. "You wish to speak with the witnesses, n'est-ce pas?" Armand asked. "They have agreed to meet you here, as you requested." One by one, they came. Mr. Leonard Rowe arrived first. A man of robust cheer, dressed in a checked suit that suggested both prosperity and a taste for pattern, he shook Poirot's hand heartily. "Terrible business, monsieur," he said. "I've dined here for years, never seen the like. Poor fellow gone just like that." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "You were seated quite near to Monsieur Harcourt, I believe." "2 tables away, yes. I couldn't help noticing them, the chap and his secretary." She looked uneasy. At one point, before the main course, she slipped him something under the table. Small packet, looked like papers, but who's to say? He put it away sharpish. Poirot's eyes rested on Rowe's face. "And you are sure, monsieur, that it was she who passed something to him, not the other way?" Rowe frowned in thought. "Well, now, she reached into her bag, that much I'm certain." "So yes, she gave it to him." Poirot thanked him, noting how quickly Rowe spoke, as if eager to be useful. Too eager, perhaps, to examine the reliability of his memory. Next came Mrs. Eleanor Weatherby, wrapped in a fur stole that had seen better decades. She was small and bird-like, with eyes that darted and fixed suddenly, like a robin sighting a crumb. "Mr. Poirot, it was dreadful," she began, her voice a confidential whisper. One moment he was speaking, rather sharply, I thought, the next, his head was down in his plate. Quite ruined the atmosphere. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "You heard him speak sharply?" "Oh yes. Just before the collapse, I distinctly heard him say, 'We will discuss it later.' It was the tone, you see, clipped, impatient. I thought at the time it must be some private quarrel." Poirot considered. The phrase did not fit with a man intending to die within minutes. It spoke instead of unfinished business, of something to be resolved. "Did you notice anything else?" Mrs. Weatherby's head tilted in thought. "The young lady, Miss Briggs, I believe, seemed anxious. She hardly touched her wine." Finally, Poirot spoke with the waiter who had served Harcourt's table, a slim young man named Jules, whose neat uniform seemed almost too big for him. "I remember the moment very well, monsieur," Jules said. Monsieur Harcourt raised his glass, red wine, the Burgundy. He drank alone, Mademoiselle Briggs's glass was still full. Then, almost immediately, he coughed, and his color changed. I thought at first he was choking. Poirot's moustache twitched. "You are certain, mon ami, that she did not drink?" "Certain, monsieur. I had just refilled both glasses before the fish course. She did not touch hers." When the witnesses had gone, Poirot remained in the restaurant, strolling slowly between the tables. He imagined the scene as it had been: the grey-suited barrister, the pale secretary, the nearby diners, the mirror catching everything. He pictured Harcourt lifting the glass, the liquid touching the rim, and the white dust Poirot had seen later on the bread plate. A thought occurred to him. He asked Armand to have Harcourt's exact table set again, in the same position, with chairs placed as they had been. Poirot sat where Harcourt had sat, back to the mirror. From this position, one could watch the reflection of the room without turning. More importantly, anyone approaching could see Harcourt's actions in the mirror, and time their own movements accordingly. He shifted in the chair, adjusted the wine glass. The angle was such that a subtle change in its position, a quarter turn, would bring a previously untouched section of the rim to the lips. If a section of that rim had been prepared in advance with a soluble poison, the result would be deadly. Poirot then visited the kitchen. The head chef, a formidable man named Dupont, swore that no powders, salts, or unusual garnishes had been used in Harcourt's dishes. The bread plates had been set automatically with every meal, whether ordered or not, but Harcourt's remained unused. Yet, Poirot murmured, one of them was used, but not for bread. Dupont looked puzzled. Poirot thanked him and returned to the dining room. Before leaving, Poirot took a final look at the mirror. He traced the line of sight from Harcourt's table to the door, to the bar, to the hallway leading to the lavatories and the side entrance. From here, a person could see Harcourt without being seen directly, and, perhaps, approach unnoticed for a brief, decisive moment. As he stood there, Armand came quietly to his side. "There is something you should know, Monsieur Poirot," he said softly. "On the night of the incident, one of our staff saw a man enter by the side door, not a customer, not a regular. He was well dressed, but he went straight to the lavatory. We thought nothing of it at the time." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And this man, he left by the same door?" Armand nodded. "Before the police arrived." Walking back through the fog, Poirot assembled the morning's harvest of facts. Rose claimed that Miss Briggs passed Harcourt something. Mrs. Weatherby's overheard remark, "We will discuss it later." The waiter's insistence that Miss Briggs had not drunk. The table's position, the mirror, the ease with which a glass could be turned. A mysterious man arriving and departing quietly by the side door. Poirot smiled to himself. The pieces were beginning to take shape. Somewhere among them was the hand that had turned the glass and sealed Harcourt's fate. But that hand, Poirot suspected, did not belong to Miss Briggs. By the time he reached his flat, the Belgian had decided his next move. He would find out who in Harcourt's life might have caused to slip into a restaurant unseen, and the skill, or audacity, to kill without leaving a trace. He poured himself a tisane, settled in his armchair, and allowed the fog to close around the city. The murderer was still out there, but not for long, Poirot promised himself. Not for long. Chapter 4 of The Little Things. The following morning, the winter sun did its best to press through a dull canopy of clouds, succeeding only in making the fog a paler shade of grey. Hercule Poirot, however, was in a mood as precise as his breakfast, a single croissant, coffee at the correct temperature, and the daily satisfaction of arranging his cutlery parallel before lifting a bite. He intended to revisit La Belle Étoile, not for another conversation with its patrons, but to conduct a meticulous examination of the scene itself. He arrived just after the lunch preparations had begun. The scent of chopped herbs and simmering stock drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the lemon and beeswax polish of the dining room. Armand met him with a sigh both theatrical and genuine. Mon cher Poirot, you have already combed my dining room like a gardener in spring, he said, spreading his hands. What more can you hope to find? Poirot's eyes gleamed. It is the gardener who knows that the smallest weed may strangle the prize rose, mon ami. We shall look for the weeds. The staff had set Harcourt's table again, exactly as on the night of his death. Poirot studied it like a chess master considering a board mid-game. His gaze travelled from the mirror on the wall to the chair placement, to the precise spacing between the wine glass and the bread plate. The bread plate drew his attention first. He bent over it, running a fingertip along the rim. It came away faintly chalky. Poirot sniffed delicately, then touched the residue to his tongue. It was bitter, not culinary salt, nor sugar. A hint of chemical origin. Dupont, the chef, was summoned. He frowned when shown the plate. This? It is not from my kitchen. We wash in scalding water and polish with linen. There is nothing that leaves a powder. Poirot nodded. Just so. And yet here, on the plate untouched by bread, there is a trace. A trace which might also, with care, be transferred elsewhere, to the rim of a glass, perhaps. Dupont looked at him sharply. You think someone used my tableware to poison the man? Poirot spread his hands. I think, mon ami, that your tableware was used, but not by you. From there, Poirot moved to the mirror, placing himself in Harcourt's chair. He studied the reflections, the doors, the bar, the hallway to the lavatories, the main entrance, all visible without turning one's head. In the mirror, a person could watch for the moment when a diner was distracted, could glide forward, make a small adjustment, and retreat, unseen by most of the room. To test the theory, Poirot enlisted Jules, the young waiter. Stand at the bar, he instructed. Now, when I lift my hand, come to the table, turn the wine glass by a quarter, and return. Jules obeyed. The motion took fewer than 3 seconds. Viewed in the mirror, it was barely a flicker. Seen directly, it might be mistaken for clearing crumbs or adjusting a napkin. Yes, Poirot murmured. It could be done very easily. Especially if the victim's attention was on his companion. Next, Poirot examined the tablecloth stacked in the linen cupboard. Among them, one caught his attention, faint but unmistakable dark stains in the pattern of a wine spill, yet oddly concentrated in a narrow arc, as though the spill had occurred from a very specific point on the rim of a glass. Armand confirmed that it had been from Harcourt's table, hastily removed after the police took photographs. The stain tells me something, Poirot said softly. It is not the result of clumsy drinking. It is from the movement of the poisoned wine as the glass was adjusted. The rim left its mark before the drink was taken. Armand crossed himself involuntarily. So deliberate. Poirot then ventured into the kitchen's back hallway, tracing the route to the side entrance. This door, narrow and unadorned, opened onto a lane parallel to the main street. It was easy to imagine a man entering here without attracting attention, especially if dressed in a way that suggested he belonged. Armand admitted reluctantly that the latch on this door sometimes failed to catch. The deliveries come in and out, and the door is left. It would not be difficult for someone to slip inside. Poirot stood in the doorway, picturing it, Harcourt at his table, Miss Briggs stepping away, perhaps to the powder room, a figure entering silently, adjusting the wine glass under the guise of passing by, the powder dissolving unnoticed until the next sip. In the afternoon, Poirot called at Harcourt's chambers once more. This time, he took greater liberty in inspecting the personal items on the desk. His gloved fingers traced the vacant ring in the dust where the original inkwell had stood. The replacement bottle, the one with the faint chemical odor, still occupied the center of the desk. Poirot removed a handkerchief from his pocket, dabbed it lightly against the bottle's lip, and sealed it in an envelope. One never knows when a little analysis will be required, he said aloud to no one. From the filing cabinet, he found a case file marked Vale, confidential. Inside was a series of notes in Harcourt's sharp hand, detailing the disciplinary ruin of a fellow barrister named Simon Vale. The file included letters, some more threatening than legal, and a final page with only 2 words underlined twice, "Find proof." Returning home in the early evening, Poirot sat at his desk and reviewed his growing list of observations. Harcourt's napkin had been folded, suggesting calm, not chaos. The bread plate bore traces of a chemical powder. The mirror allowed unobtrusive monitoring of the victim. The wine glass could be rotated quickly and without fuss. The tablecloth stain indicated an altered glass position. The side entrance permitted discreet comings and goings. Harcourt's inkwell had been replaced with something tainted. A man named Simon Vale had a motive rooted in professional ruin. The pieces formed not a line, but a net. Within it, somewhere, the murderer was caught. Poirot's fingers drummed lightly on the desk. He was certain now that Harcourt had not killed himself. The poison was applied in such a way that it must be delivered at the very last moment, and that was the work of an intruder, not the victim. But how to prove it? That would require something more delicate, the observation of habit. For just as the smallest weed betrays itself by its leaf, so does the criminal betray himself by the gestures he cannot resist. Poirot leaned back, eyes half closed. The little grey cells were stirring, and soon they would speak. Chapter 5: Shadows of the Past. The rain had given way to a cold, pewter-coloured afternoon when Hercule Poirot arrived at the Inns of Court. The barrister's chamber stood in a square of orderly brick and stone, their windows bright in the gloom. Poirot, who admired order when it was not mistaken for virtue, mounted the steps to the chambers of Simon Vale. Vale received him with the courtesy of a man who wished to end the interview before it began. Tall, spare, with iron-grey hair swept back in uncompromising lines, he wore his barrister's gown as if it were armour. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I've been told you have questions." "I can't imagine why." Philip Harcourt's death was a personal tragedy, yes, but a private one. Poirot sat, adjusting the crease of his trousers with delicate precision. "A private one, monsieur? Forgive me, but you and he were not friends, n'est-ce pas?" Vale's lips tightened. "Harcourt destroyed my career. Not by lies, no, that would have been easier to bear, but by parading my personal failings before the disciplinary board. He made certain I would never again stand in court without whispers following me." Poirot murmured, "because of the affair with the client." The faintest twitch passed over Vale's face. "The details are immaterial. I was indiscreet. Harcourt was merciless." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "you attended La Belle Étoile on the night of his death." Vale's head snapped up. "I most certainly did not. I was in Paris, meetings with a potential investor. You can check the hotel register." Poirot inclined his head politely, but a small note of doubt hummed in his mind. Registers could be signed by proxy, alibis could be bought with enough determination. From Vale's chambers, Poirot walked to Harcourt's flat, a neat address in Kensington. The door was opened by a housekeeper whose manner was brisk to the point of defence. "Horrible business," she said, leading Poirot into a sitting room that smelt faintly of tobacco and leather. "But I can't say I'm surprised. Mr. Harcourt made enemies, plenty of them. He was clever, but not the kind." Poirot noted the room's orderliness, every book upright, every cushion plumped. On the mantelpiece stood a row of silver-framed photographs, none, Poirot observed, a family. All were of Harcourt at formal events, robed and wigged, shaking hands with men of influence. "Tell me," Poirot asked, "did Monsieur Harcourt ever speak of a Simon Vale?" The housekeeper sniffed. "Spoke of him? He crowed about him. Said he'd put Vale in his place for good. I think he enjoyed it, if you want the truth." And Miss Briggs? Did she visit here? Once or twice. Always polite, but nervous. He could make people feel small. Poirot returned to his flat with more shadows than answers. The picture forming was of a man both brilliant and abrasive, who had accumulated grudges like barnacles on a ship's hull. Any one of them could have been lethal in the right moment. That evening, over tisane, Poirot reviewed the notes from his previous interviews. Miss Briggs, possibly withholding details about the papers she passed Harcourt. Rowe, who seemed too certain of what he'd seen. Mrs. Weatherby, whose sharp ears had caught a phrase suggesting unfinished business. The mysterious man at the side entrance, described only in general terms. Vale, with his professed Paris alibi and a motive rooted in humiliation. A lesser mind might have concluded Vale's guilt on motive alone. But Poirot had learned long ago that motive was the easiest thing to plant in the mind of an investigator, especially if the murderer wished to direct suspicion elsewhere. The next day, Poirot asked Miss Briggs to meet him at a small tea room off Sloane Square. She arrived in a plain navy coat, her hair drawn back severely, as though tidiness might defend her from suspicion. "Monsieur Poirot," she said as she sat, "I hope you're not going to tell me the police think I've done something. I cared about Mr. Harcourt, despite everything. I wanted to leave, yes, but not like that." Poirot stirred his tea. "Then perhaps you can help me. The packet you gave him at dinner, legal papers, you said. For which client?" She hesitated. "I can't say. They were personal, about a matter he was handling discreetly." "Discreetly?" Poirot prompted. Her gaze dropped to the table. "It concerned someone of influence. If it came out, it could ruin reputations." "And did Monsieur Harcourt suggest he might use these papers as leverage?" She looked up sharply. "He hinted. That was his way. He liked to remind people of what he knew, and what it might be worth to keep quiet." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then you see, mademoiselle, that his death might be most convenient to more than one person." That afternoon, Poirot visited Inspector Sharp at the station. The inspector, half buried in paperwork, looked up with weary resignation. "Back again? Let me guess, you found another reason to doubt the obvious." Poirot smiled. "Indeed. I have found not one reason, but many. Consider, my friend Harcourt was in possession of documents which could destroy reputations. He was dining in a public place, where an enemy might act unnoticed. There was access to the table without passing the main entrance. And there was a man, described by your own witnesses, who entered by the side door and left before you arrived." Sharp rubbed his forehead. "It's still circumstantial. And you're still thinking Vale, aren't you?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Ah, that is what you think I think. But no, I have not yet decided. Vale has motive and perhaps opportunity. But opportunity is like the hat, Inspector, many heads may wear it, yet only one fits perfectly." By evening, Poirot felt the shape of the truth beginning to emerge. It was still blurred at the edges, but he sensed that the solution would not lie in dramatic evidence or a sudden confession. It would lie, as it so often did, in the smallest habits, the things a person does without thinking, and thus without guarding against detection. He stood by the window of his flat, looking out at the wet street. In the glass, his reflection stared back, framed by the lamps behind him. He thought again of the mirror at La Belle Étoile, and how it gave away the slightest movement to one who knew where to look. "Minoirs," he murmured to himself. "They show not only what is, but also what should not be." The next move was clear. He would set a little stage, invite his suspects to attend, and watch, not for their words, but for the telling gestures of their hands. Chapter 6: Red Herrings. The fog was thicker than ever that evening, clinging to the lamplight and muting the rattle of passing cabs. Hercule Poirot, wrapped in a perfectly brushed overcoat, stepped out into the damp air with a list of calls to make. He was in pursuit not of grand revelations, but of the small misdirections, those charming little lies and convenient omissions that, once collected, might form the outline of a truth no one wished to see. Inspector Sharp's voice still echoed in his mind from the day before, "It's circumstantial." Poirot knew that phrase. It was the tired shrug of an investigator who had found a story that seemed to fit and was unwilling to see where the seams gaped. The official line was set: Harcourt had killed himself, and Miss Clara Briggs had been the unfortunate witness. But Poirot was not content. He had seen too many murders dressed up in the costume of suicide. The wrongness of it gnawed at him. Harcourt's neatness, the timing, the subtle arrangement of the table, these were not the gestures of a man making a final, chaotic exit. They were the background to a performance, one staged by another hand. Poirot's first stop was the wine shop owned by Leonard Rowe, the robust merchant who had claimed to see Miss Briggs pass something to Harcourt at dinner. Rowe greeted him warmly, perhaps too warmly, and poured 2 small glasses of a deep ruby claret as though the Belgian were an old friend. "Still working on that unfortunate business?" Rowe said, with the air of a man inviting gossip. Poirot sipped delicately. "I like to have certainty, Monsieur Rowe." "Tell me again, you saw Miss Briggs pass Harcourt a packet?" "Plain as day," Rowe said. "She reached into her bag, slid it across under the tablecloth. Thought at the time it looked a bit furtive." Poirot tilted his head. "And you noticed this while dining yourself? With your own glass before you, your own conversation?" Rowe hesitated only a fraction too long. "Well, I have an eye for detail." "Ah," Poirot said, setting down his glass. "But detail, monsieur, is a slippery thing. Sometimes we see what we expect to see, not what truly happens." Rowe laughed a little too heartily and changed the subject to the virtues of a certain Burgundy vintage. Poirot left with a distinct impression that Rowe's memory was embroidered for effect, whether to please himself or to please the police, he could not yet say. His next call was upon Mrs. Eleanor Weatherby, the elderly widow with the robin-like dart of the eyes. She lived in a narrow house in Pimlico, its hallway crowded with porcelain dogs and framed needlework. Over weak tea served in china cups, she repeated her recollection of hearing Harcourt say, "We will discuss it later." Poirot asked, as he had not before, about her own movements that night. "Oh, I barely left my seat," she said. "Except perhaps, yes, I did go to the ladies' room just before the main course. But only for a moment." "And you passed by Harcourt's table?" Poirot asked gently. Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "Yes, but I hardly looked at them. One doesn't stare at strangers." Poirot filed it away. The ladies' room lay along the same corridor as the side entrance. A person could, in theory, meet someone in that short stretch unseen by the main dining room. From Pimlico, Poirot took a cab to the modest flat of Miss Briggs. She opened the door looking pale and tired, as though sleep had been rationed. "I thought we'd been through everything," she said, though without sharpness. Poirot smiled faintly. "There is always one more thing, mademoiselle. On the night in question, did you leave the table at any point?" She nodded reluctantly. "Briefly, to powder my nose. I wasn't gone more than a minute." "During that minute, could someone have approached Harcourt?" Her eyes flickered. "I suppose so. But why would they?" She stopped herself, then said quickly, "He was fine when I left him." Poirot observed the small twitch of her hands, the way they sought the edge of her cardigan as if to steady themselves. There was more she wished to say, but perhaps feared to. In the evening, Poirot called upon Inspector Sharp at the station. The inspector looked up from a desk piled with forms, his expression that of a man bracing for the peculiar. "What is it now, Poirot?" "Found another shadow to chase." Not a shadow, my friend, Poirot replied, settling into a chair. A pattern. You have considered Miss Briggs, and perhaps Vale. But you have overlooked two others with equal opportunity. Sharp raised an eyebrow. Rowan Weatherby? What, the wine man and the old widow? Surely not. Poirot steepled his fingers. Surely yes, at least in possibility. Both left their tables. Both could have passed the side entrance. Both could have approached Harcourt under the guise of a chance word. And both, if you will recall, are very certain about what they saw, perhaps because certainty is the best disguise for invention. Sharp shook his head. You'll have everyone in that restaurant guilty before long. Poirot's moustaches twitched. Maisnon, only one will be guilty. But until I see the gesture, I cannot be sure which. Poirot's mind returned to the scene in the mirror at La Belle Étoile. That narrow quarter-turn of the wine glass, so small, so telling, was the crux. The murderer had performed it almost without thinking. If that habit remained, Poirot would see it again, given the right setting. That night, alone in his flat, he drafted a series of invitations in his neat, flowing hand. A small gathering, he wrote, to honor the memory of Philip Harcourt, to be held, most appropriately, at La Belle Étoile. Armand would provide the dinner, Poirot the conversation. All the key figures from that night would be there at Miss Briggs, Rowe, Mrs. Weatherby, and, if his instincts were correct, Simon Vale. The trap would not be sprung with drama or confrontation, but with a moment so ordinary the guilty party would not even feel the eyes upon them. Poirot would give them their chance to betray themselves, with the same careless precision they had shown on the night Harcourt died. As he sealed the last envelope, Poirot murmured in French, "It is always the little things, and the little things are impossible to hide forever." Chapter 7. The trap is set. The fog had thinned to a low mist by the evening of Poirot's carefully arranged gathering. La Belle Étoile was at its most polished, the brass fittings shone, candles glowed in crystal holders, and the scent of roasting meat hung in the air like a promise. Poirot arrived early, of course. He took his seat at a long table near the center of the dining room, not in his preferred hidden corner, but in a position chosen with tactical precision. From here, the great mirrored wall reflected every movement of every guest. The murderer's gesture, if it came, would not escape his eye. Armand had outdone himself. The table was dressed with gleaming silverware, wine glasses set in perfect symmetry, and napkins folded into crisp fans. Place cards bore each guest's name in elegant script: Miss Clara Briggs, Mr. Leonard Rowe, Mrs. Eleanor Weatherby, Mr. Simon Vale. One by one, they arrived. Miss Briggs was first, in a dark dress that did little to soften her pale complexion. She seemed nervous, her eyes darting between the door and Poirot as she took her seat. Rowe entered next, all hearty cheer and handshakes, his checked suit a burst of color against the subdued surroundings. He greeted Miss Briggs with an enthusiasm she did not appear to return. Mrs. Weatherby followed, wrapped in her fur stole, moving with the delicate precision of a bird alighting on a branch. She gave a polite nod to Poirot and settled at her place with an approving glance at the silverware. Finally, Simon Vale arrived, tall and coldly elegant, his overcoat draped neatly over his arm. His eyes flickered around the table, registering each face, before he took the seat opposite Poirot. "Miss Amos," Poirot began once they were all assembled, "I thank you for coming. We are here, as you know, to remember Monsieur Philip Harcourt, and perhaps, in the sharing of food and conversation, to better understand the man and the circumstances of his death." There was a faint shifting among the guests. Vale looked politely bored. Rowe poured himself a generous glass of the opening wine. The first course was served, a delicate salade niçoise. Poirot engaged each guest in turn with seemingly harmless questions: Rowe, about his wine trade; Mrs. Weatherby, about her late husband's military service; Vale, about his supposed trip to Paris; Miss Briggs, about her plans after Harcourt's passing. It was during these exchanges that Poirot noted the little things, the way Rowe rearranged the cutlery unconsciously, the way Mrs. Weatherby aligned her salt and pepper shakers before eating, the way Vale's eyes flickered to the mirror from time to time, as if aware of being watched. But there was nothing yet to match the gesture Poirot sought. The second course arrived, roast duck with a dark cherry glaze. Armand himself poured the wine, moving from guest to guest. Poirot thanked him with a nod, then, as if by accident, let his spoon fall to the floor with a sharp clatter. "Ah! Pardon, Miss Amos," he said, bending slightly in his chair. "Would someone be so kind?" The moment was a simple one, an opportunity for courtesy. But in the mirror, Poirot's sharp eyes saw it. Simon Vale's hand moved not toward the spoon, but toward Miss Briggs's glass. With a small, almost unconscious adjustment, he shifted it a fraction of an inch, rotating it just enough to bring a different section of the rim forward. It was the same subtle quarter-turn Poirot had deduced from Harcourt's tablecloth stain. Poirot straightened in his chair and thanked Vale smoothly, as though nothing had happened. Inside, his little grey cells danced. The gesture was not necessary. Miss Briggs's glass had been perfectly placed, but it was habitual, the sign of a man who liked to control the arrangement of objects around him. Dinner continued. Poirot asked Vale about his Paris trip again, this time with casual contradictions. Vale answered smoothly, but there were pauses just a shade too long. Mrs. Weatherby chattered about her garden. Rowe launched into a tale about a shipment of Bordeaux nearly lost at sea. Between courses, Poirot excused himself briefly, stepping into the hallway by the side entrance. The latch was still faulty, the door gave under the lightest push. From here, one could slip into the dining room in seconds. Poirot returned to the table without comment. The final course was served, chocolate soufflé, the dish Armand had promised him weeks before. Poirot waited until the plates were set down, then folded his hands and said, "My friends, I am afraid I have brought you here under a slight pretext. We have shared a meal, yes, but also a test." A ripple of unease moved around the table. Poirot's voice was calm. On the night Philip Harcourt died, someone approached his table, turned his wine glass so that a poisoned section of the rim came to his lips, and departed unnoticed. Tonight, I sought to see who among us carries the habit of such an action. His gaze rested on Vale. "Monsieur, when I dropped my spoon, you reached, not for the spoon, but for Mademoiselle Briggs's glass. You turned it, as you must have turned Harcourt's." Vale's eyes narrowed. "That's absurd. I was moving it so she wouldn't spill it." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but she was not in danger of spilling it. And yet you cannot help yourself, you must place things just so. A small habit, but deadly in this case." Miss Briggs gasped softly. Rowe shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes were wide and unblinking. Poirot continued, "On that night, you entered by the side door while Miss Briggs had stepped away. You turned Harcourt's glass, prepared with poison on one section of the rim, and left by the same route. Later, you placed the vial in his pocket, knowing the scandal of his recent troubles would make suicide plausible." Vale gave a short, cold laugh. "And you can prove this?" "Oh, Poirot said. "The mirror saw it then, as I saw it tonight. And there are other proofs, the chemical traces on Harcourt's bread plate, the missing inkwell from his office, the false alibi you gave of Paris. All, Inspector Sharp will confirm, fit you as neatly as your barrister's gown." There was a silence heavy as the fog outside. Poirot dabbed his lips with his napkin. "But the details, Miss Amos, they are for tomorrow. Tonight, we have finished our little performance." Chapter 8, The Truth Revealed. The morning after the dinner at La Belle Étoile, a small group gathered once again in the restaurant's private room. The fog had retreated, leaving the streets washed clean and pale in the winter light. Inside, Inspector Sharp stood near the doorway, notebook in hand, while Miss Briggs, Rowe, Mrs. Weatherby, and Simon Vale sat at the same table as the night before. Poirot, immaculate in a grey suit and polished shoes, took his place at the head. "My friends," Poirot began, his voice carrying easily, "last night you indulged me in a little experiment. It was most enlightening. Now, as is my custom, I will explain, from the beginning to the end, how the truth of Philip Harcourt's death revealed itself to me." He paused, letting his gaze travel slowly over each face. "When Monsieur Harcourt collapsed in this very room, the evidence seemed to point to suicide. A vial of poison in his pocket, a note reading 'It ends here,' and a companion who spoke of his recent despondency. The police were content. But I, Hercule Poirot, was not. Why? Because of the little things." He held up a finger. "First, the folded napkin beside his plate. This is not the gesture of a man in the chaos of self-destruction. It is the act of one who expects to return to his meal, or who wishes to leave the appearance of calm." A second finger joined the first. "Second, the unused bread plate bearing traces of a fine white powder, bitter to the taste. Powder which could be transferred to the rim of a glass and, once dissolved, would be invisible. A curious place for such a substance to be, unless it was a staging area for the fatal act." He extended a third finger. "Third, the arrangement of this dining room. Harcourt's seat faced the mirrored wall, allowing him to see the entire room without turning. But it also allowed someone behind him to observe his movements, to wait for the moment when his companion stepped away and the victim's attention was elsewhere." Poirot glanced toward the side corridor. "Fourth, the side entrance. Unlatched, easy to open, and mere steps from the dining room. Witnesses spoke of a well-dressed man entering by this route on the night of the death and leaving before the police arrived. Such a man could slip in, act quickly, and be gone without notice." Inspector Sharp nodded, his pen scratching across the page. Poirot continued, his voice as precise as a metronome. "Then there was the matter of the wine glass. The stain on the tablecloth from Harcourt's table was not the broad mark of a spill, but a narrow arc, the signature of a glass being rotated. A quarter turn would bring a previously untouched section of the rim to the lips. If that section bore the poison, the victim would be doomed at the next sip." He fixed his eyes on Vale. "Monsieur Vale, last night, when I dropped my spoon, you revealed your habit. You reached, not for the spoon, but for Mademoiselle Briggs's glass, and turned it, just as you must have turned Harcourt's. It was a reflex, a compulsion to arrange the objects before you. You could not resist." Vale's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Poirot pressed on. "Your motive was clear from the files in Harcourt's office. He had ruined you professionally, exposing an affair that ended your career. You were in Paris, you claimed, yet there is no one who saw you there on the night in question, save for a hotel register signed in your hand. A register which could easily have been signed earlier or by arrangement." He turned to Miss Briggs, his tone softening. "Mademoiselle, you feared you might be accused because you had quarrelled with your employer and handed him a packet at dinner. But I believe you now, the packet was legal documents, nothing more. Your only misfortune was to leave the table at the wrong moment." Poirot's gaze shifted to the others. "Monsieur Rowe, you claim to see Miss Briggs pass something under the table, yet your seat and the position of the napkin would have made such observation unlikely. I believe your recollection was embroidered. And Madame Weatherby, you too left your table, passing by the side corridor, but only in the ordinary course of visiting the ladies' room." He folded his hands. "No, the only person with the knowledge, the motive, and the nerve to approach unseen, adjust the wine glass, and plant the vial in Harcourt's pocket was Simon Vale. You came by the side entrance, having timed your arrival to coincide with Miss Briggs's brief absence. You carried with you the poison, perhaps concealed in a silver cigarette case such as you were seen handling here before. You applied it to the rim of Harcourt's glass, turned the glass so he would drink from the tainted section, and left before the poison took hold. Later, when the commotion began, you returned by the main door as though nothing had happened. Vale's voice, when it came, was cold. You have no proof of this beyond your little things. Poirot's moustaches twitched. On the contrary, monsieur. There is proof enough for the law. The traces of the same powder found on Harcourt's bread plate will, I believe, match the chemical residue on the handkerchief I pressed against your cigarette case when you so obligingly returned it to your pocket last night. Inspector Sharp has already arranged for the analysis. Sharp stepped forward. We have Vale. And I've a feeling it's going to be a match. For the first time, Vale's composure faltered. His eyes flicked to the side entrance, then back to Poirot. You're very sure of yourself, aren't you? Poirot rose, adjusting his cuffs. When the pieces fit so neatly, monsieur, it would be untidy to be unsure. There was a silence as the inspector moved to place Vale under arrest. Miss Briggs let out a long, unsteady breath. Mrs. Weatherby shook her head slowly. Rowe muttered something about never doubting Poirot's cleverness. Later, when the others had gone, Poirot remained at the table, sipping a final cup of coffee. Armand approached quietly. You knew from the start, didn't you? The maître d'hôtel asked. Poirot smiled faintly. From the start, I knew only that suicide did not fit. A man's habits, his petites manies, do not change in the moment before death. Harcourt was a man of control. The disorder of that night was not his doing. All that remained was to find the one whose habits betrayed them, and give him the chance to repeat them. He rose, gathering his gloves and hat. In murder, as in dining, it is always the little things that decide the success or the failure. And Simon Vale, he was too proud to think the little things could catch him. Poirot walked out into the pale winter morning, the mist curling at his heels, content that the case, like his table settings, had been brought into perfect order.